There's a piece of evidence in the Biffle citation crash investigation that has barely been discussed in most coverage, but it might fundamentally change our understanding of what happened in those first critical seconds after takeoff. A witness on the ground, someone who had no connection to the flight, someone who was simply going about their morning, heard something that could rewrite the narrative of this accident. A loud pop. Not after the aircraft had been climbing for a minute or two, not when the aircraft was maneuvering back toward the airport, but during takeoff itself, right at the beginning of the flight, possibly even before the aircraft had fully left the ground. Today we're going to examine this witness testimony, what a loud pop at takeoff could indicate mechanically, why this changes our understanding of the accident sequence, and what it means for the investigation going forward. This is critical new information that suggests the crew may have been dealing with a catastrophic failure even earlier than we thought, with even less time and altitude to respond than previous analysis indicated. The witness is Jonathan Donahue, and his connection to this tragedy is personal and geographic. Donahue was a neighbor of Dennis Dutton. They lived in the same area, knew each other, were part of the same community. On the morning of the accident, Donahue was at home, going about his normal routine, when he heard something unusual. According to an interview Donahue gave to the U.S. Sun, he heard a loud pop coming from the direction of the airport during the time the citation would have been taking off. Now, before we analyze what this means, we need to understand the significance of witness testimony in aviation accident investigations. Eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable in many respects. People misremember timing, they conflate events, they're influenced by what they learn after the fact. Memory is reconstructive, not photographic. This is well established in psychological research. But certain types of witness observations are quite reliable, particularly when they involve distinctive sounds or events that the witness had no expectation of and no reason to fabricate. A loud pop is a very specific auditory event. It's not something you imagine or misremember. Either you heard a loud pop or you didn't. And if Donahue heard a loud pop coming from the direction of the airport at the time the citation was taking off, that's significant evidence that something happened during the takeoff itself, not after the aircraft was already established in the climb. Let's talk about what could cause a loud pop audible from the ground during an aircraft takeoff. There are several possibilities, some more likely than others given what we know about the accident. The first and most obvious possibility is an engine compressor stall or surge. When a jet engine experiences disrupted airflow through the compressor section, it can create a violent pressure reversal that produces an extremely loud bang or pop. This can be caused by ingesting debris, by sudden throttle movements, by aerodynamic disruption. A compressor stall in a turbofan engine sounds like a gunshot or an explosion. It's startlingly loud. It can absolutely be heard from the ground, even at an airport with other ambient noise. If the citation's right engine ingested something during the takeoff roll or just after rotation, it could have experienced a compressor stall before the catastrophic failure that destroyed the engine. That initial stall might have been the loud pop Donahue heard. Another possibility is a tire failure. Aircraft tires operate under tremendous stress during takeoff. They're supporting the full weight of the aircraft while accelerating to over 100 miles per hour on a runway surface that might have debris or rough patches. Tire failures during takeoff are not common, but they do occur, and when they happen, they produce a very loud bang. However, a tire failure typically wouldn't lead to an engine failure unless debris from the tire was ingested into an engine, which is possible but less likely. A third possibility, and this is more concerning, is a structural failure. A loud pop could indicate something breaking or separating from the aircraft. A baggage door latch failing and the door beginning to open could produce a popping sound as the latch broke or as the door initially separated from its frame. If the right-hand baggage compartment door, which we know is missing from the wreckage, failed during the takeoff roll or immediately after rotation, that failure might have produced the loud pop Donahue heard. There's also the possibility of a bird strike. Aircraft hitting birds, especially large birds or flocks of birds, can produce very loud impact sounds. If the citation struck one or more birds during takeoff, and those birds were ingested into the engine, That could explain both the loud pop and the subsequent engine failure. However, bird strike debris is usually identifiable in wreckage examination, and we haven't heard any reports of bird strike evidence, though that doesn't mean it wasn't a factor. Let's focus on the most likely scenario based on all available evidence, the baggage door. We know from post-crash photographs that the right-hand nose baggage compartment door is missing from the wreckage. We know that Citation baggage doors on older models are not electronically monitored, so there's no cockpit indication if they're not properly latched. We know from precedent that this exact failure mode, a baggage door opening and items being ingested into the engine, has occurred on Citations before. If the baggage door was not properly latched before takeoff, what would happen during the takeoff sequence? During the takeoff roll, as the aircraft accelerates down the runway, airspeed is building. At rotation speed, around 90 to 100 knots for a Citation, the pilot pulls back on the yoke and the nose rises. As the nose rises, the airflow over the forward fuselage changes dramatically. The relative wind is now coming from below and ahead rather than straight ahead. This change in airflow direction could create the aerodynamic forces necessary to pull an improperly latched baggage door open. The door, which might have seemed secure on the ground or during the early part of the takeoff roll, suddenly experiences forces trying to push or pull it open. If the latches weren't fully engaged, if they were only partially closed, those forces could overcome the weak connection and pop the door open. That moment, the moment the door pops open, would produce an audible sound, a loud pop or bang as the latches break or release and the door swings open against the airstream. This would occur right at rotation, right at the moment when the aircraft is lifting off or has just lifted off. And if Donahue was outside, if there wasn't too much other noise, if he was relatively close to the airport, he could absolutely have heard that sound. If the baggage door opened at rotation or immediately after liftoff, that explains several things about the accident sequence. First, it explains why the failure occurred so early, why the crew had so little altitude to work with. If the door opened as the aircraft was lifting off, they were probably only at a few hundred feet when items started being ingested into the engine and the engine began to fail. Second, it explains why the crew might have been confused or uncertain about what was happening. If the door opened at rotation, they would have been extremely busy at that moment, lifting off, raising landing gear, beginning the climb, transitioning from visual reference to the runway to visual reference to the horizon and instruments. A loud pop and possible vibration or unusual noise in that critical phase could have been disorienting and concerning, but not immediately diagnostic. Third, it explains the compressed timeline. If the failure began at liftoff rather than after a minute or two of climb, the crew had even less time than we thought to recognize the problem, diagnose it, make decisions, and execute a response. From liftoff to impact was approximately 10 minutes total, but if the failure began immediately at liftoff, they may have had only seconds of normal flight before chaos began. Let's walk through a reconstructed timeline incorporating this witness testimony. The Citation begins its takeoff roll on runway 10. Engines spooled up to takeoff power, brakes released, aircraft accelerating. Everything normal. At around 90 to 100 knots, rotation speed, the pilot pulls back and the nose rises. The aircraft is lifting off. At this exact moment, the improperly latched right baggage door, now experiencing different aerodynamic forces as the nose rises, pops open. Jonathan Donahue, outside his home some distance from the airport, hears a loud pop. Inside the cockpit, the crew hears or feels something. Maybe a loud bang, maybe unusual vibration. Maybe they see the baggage door light if there is one, though older Citations don't have them. But they're in a critical phase of flight. They're lifting off. Their immediate priority is to fly the aircraft, to establish a positive rate of climb, to get the gear up, to accelerate and climb away from the ground. They note that something seemed wrong, but they're focused on the immediate task of getting safely airborne. Within seconds, items from the now open baggage compartment begin to be expelled by the airflow. Bags, luggage, loose items, whatever was stored in there. Some of this debris is swept directly into the right engine intake because of the unfortunate geometry of the baggage door position relative to the engine. The engine ingests something solid, Fan blades strike it. The catastrophic failure sequence begins. Within 2 to 3 seconds of ingesting debris, the right engine is destroying itself. Fan blades shattering, compressor stages failing. Now the cockpit is full of warnings. Master warning lights, engine failure indications, possibly fire warnings. The aircraft yaws violently to the right as asymmetric thrust develops. The pilot, almost certainly Dennis Dutton, immediately applies left rudder to maintain directional control. But at this point, they're probably only at 500 to 1,000 feet above the ground. They've been airborne for maybe 10 to 20 seconds. They barely have flying speed. They're heavy with fuel. They're in a critical configuration. And they have a catastrophic engine failure they're still trying to understand. The decision about what to do, continue climbing or turn back, has to be made immediately, within seconds, with almost no information and almost no time to think. If this timeline is accurate, if the failure began at rotation or immediately after, as the loud pop suggests, it explains why the crew might have made the decision to turn back immediately. They were so low, had so little altitude, that continuing to climb might not have seemed viable. The airport was right there behind them. They'd literally just left the runway. Turning around and getting back on the ground before anything else could go wrong might have seemed like the only reasonable choice. But as we've discussed in previous analysis, that choice, while understandable, was likely what sealed their fate. Turning back from that low altitude with one engine failed, then configuring early with gear down, created a situation where they couldn't maintain altitude and came up short of the runway. The witness testimony of the loud pop also raises questions about what the crew knew and when they knew it. If there was a loud pop at rotation, did they recognize it as the baggage door opening? Or did they think it was something else, maybe a tire failure or a bird strike or an engine problem? If they didn't immediately understand that the baggage door had opened, they wouldn't have anticipated the subsequent engine failure. They would have been surprised and confused when the engine failed seconds later. This uncertainty, this incomplete understanding of what was happening, could have significantly impacted their decision-making. If you know you have an open baggage door and you know that's likely to cause an engine failure, you might make different choices than if you just know something went wrong, but you're not sure what. The crew's mental model of what they were dealing with, which would have been forming in real time based on limited information, might have been incomplete or inaccurate, leading to decisions that seemed logical based on what they thought was happening, but were actually inappropriate for what was actually happening. There's also the question of whether the loud pop was heard by the crew inside the cockpit or was only audible externally. If Donahue heard it from his home, presumably some distance from the airport, it was loud enough to carry over ambient noise and distance. Inside the cockpit, with engine noise and wind noise and systems noise, would it have been even more apparent? Or could the internal noise have masked it so the crew didn't hear it as clearly as someone on the ground did? This matters because if the crew heard a loud, distinctive pop at rotation, that's information that should have triggered immediate investigation. What was that sound? Where did it come from? What does it indicate? But if they were focused on flying the aircraft and didn't clearly hear or identify the sound, they might not have recognized it as significant until the engine failure occurred seconds later. Jonathan Donahue's witness testimony also provides potential corroboration for the baggage door theory of the accident. We've been working with the theory that the baggage door opened and caused the engine failure based on physical evidence, the missing door and the engine damage. But we didn't have direct evidence of when the door opened or what caused it to open. Donahue's testimony of a loud pop at takeoff provides that temporal marker. It suggests the door opened at rotation, which is consistent with the failure occurring very early in the flight. This witness testimony will be incredibly valuable to NTSB investigators. They'll want to interview Donahue extensively. They'll ask about his exact location when he heard the sound. They'll ask about other ambient noises that might have masked or confused what he heard. They'll ask whether he saw the aircraft or only heard it. They'll try to establish as precisely as possible when he heard the pop relative to the aircraft's position and phase of flight. They'll also try to correlate his testimony with other evidence. If the cockpit voice recorder captured a loud sound at rotation, that would corroborate Donahue's account. If other witnesses heard something similar, that would strengthen the evidence. If wreckage examination shows the baggage door latches failed in a way consistent with being forced open by aerodynamic loads, that would support the theory. The loud pop testimony also highlights the importance of seemingly minor details in accident investigation. A sound heard by one witness might seem insignificant or might be dismissed as unrelated. But when correlated with other evidence, when analyzed in context, it can provide critical information about the sequence of events and the timeline of the failure. For Citation pilots and owners, this testimony reinforces the critical importance of the baggage door pre-flight inspection. If an improperly latched door can pop open at rotation with catastrophic consequences, then verifying those latches are fully engaged isn't just a checklist item. It's potentially life-saving. Don't just glance at the door. Don't assume someone else checked it. Physically verify that every latch is fully closed and locked. It takes 30 seconds, and it could prevent your death. For investigators and safety analysts, this testimony raises questions about whether Citation baggage doors need to be redesigned or whether retrofit warning systems should be mandated. If doors can fail at rotation when aerodynamic loads change, that's a predictable failure mode. It's not a random, unlikely event. It's a scenario that will occur whenever a door isn't properly latched and the aircraft takes off. Engineering solutions exist: door position sensors, cockpit warning lights, improved latch designs that are harder to improperly close. Should these be required? The loud pop heard by Jonathan Donahue might seem like a small detail in the vast complexity of this accident investigation, but it's potentially one of the most significant pieces of evidence we have about when and how the failure sequence began. It suggests the crew was dealing with a catastrophic emergency from the moment of rotation, with almost no altitude, almost no time, and almost no opportunity to recover. It also suggests that the decisions they made, the choice to turn back immediately, the choice to configure early, all of it was made in the context of an emergency that began earlier and developed faster than previous analysis might have indicated. That doesn't excuse the decisions or change the outcome, but it provides context that helps us understand why experienced professional pilots made choices that proved fatal. As the NTSB investigation continues, as more evidence is gathered and analyzed, this witness testimony will be integrated into the overall understanding of what happened. The preliminary report should address the timeline of the failure and may reference witness statements. The final report will reconstruct the entire sequence in detail. But even now, even with limited information, Jonathan Donahue's account of hearing a loud pop at takeoff tells us something important. It tells us this accident began earlier than we might have thought. It tells us the crew had less time than we might have assumed, and it tells us that sometimes the most significant evidence comes not from sophisticated flight recorders or detailed wreckage analysis, but from an ordinary person who happened to hear something unusual and had the presence of mind to remember it and report it. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to this channel for continued updates as the investigation progresses. Share this with others following the case. And if you're a pilot, remember that witness testimony like this reinforces what we already know. Pre-flight inspections matter. Latches matter. Those seemingly minor details can be the difference between a normal flight and a tragedy. Thank you for watching.